African American studies would only criticize American slavery as if slavery were unique to America. The genuine horrors of American slavery and its consequences was a powerful weapon against traditional culture, as was the example of Rodney King. But to quote the black African King Gezo, who said in the 1840s, quote, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and the glory of all their wealth. The mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery." You see, now a quote like that shows the economic incentive of a black culture to sell other blacks into slavery purely for economic gain. Quotes like that make slavery seem less about racism and more about economics, and quotes like that show that there's a little more than white English-speaking guilt to go around. It runs contrary to the narrative, and it has to be suppressed in schools. It is politically incorrect. America, the Frankfurt School's bastion of racism and sexism, fought a civil war and lost 360,000 Union dead to eliminate the shameful heritage of slavery. America has elected a black president and run a female for vice president twice. Is there so much as a single black mayor in all of Europe? Are there even any black people living at all in China? None of that matters. It's off the narrative.
Enslaving people in chains for forced labor, owning them as property, as well as their offspring, was practiced long before the European powers even first set foot in West Africa. And European Slavs were the primary targets for enslavement in Eastern and Central Europe for several thousand years by many empires.
The fact that the majority of slaves being traded in the European and Islamic markets were Slavs meant that the Latin word for Slav, sclavus, became first synonymous with the word servus, and then, when servus became to mean serf, sclavus simply took its place and gradually, over the course of the 9th to 11th centuries, became the default word for slave. Due to this large-scale Slavic slave trade, it should not be surprising that the Slavic ethnonym became to be synonymous with slavery.
Slavs, not being a unified people and just a collection of scattered peoples, were easy to conquer and enslave.
The Slavic slave trade is an interesting part of history that is sadly not talked about much outside of academia.
There were more Europeans enslaved by North Africans than there were sub-Saharan Africans enslaved and sent to the Western Hemisphere. This was slavery based upon race. It was not created by Europeans. It was also based upon religion. For 600 years, the Ottomans practiced the largest slave trade in history, and sometimes it was brutal. Millions of Muslim slaves were Slavic Christians, among many other Christian ethnic groups.
One of the worst things a slave was forced to be was a galley slave, a rower on a warship. By the time the Ottoman Empire took Constantinople in 1453, the ships, by that time actually called galleys, were powered by both sail and manpower, and were equipped with cannons, making the lifespan of most galley slaves even more miserable. The slaves chained to the oars and benches in Ottoman ships were often never allowed to leave their place. They slept there, ate and drank their meager portions there, and relieved themselves there too. Slaves essentially rotted on the benches. In the Ottoman Empire, boys, including some boys kidnapped for use in the Janissaries, and many educated men, were castrated. Some boys sang. Others grew up to be harem guards. Educated men sent to teach or advise the extensive royal family or the wives of high officials were also castrated.
The Slavic slaves captured by the Bohemians and the Franks were mostly sent to Verdun, which was a major medieval slave hub where many of the Slavic slaves were castrated. The survival rate of castration in medieval Europe was quite low.
Why? Castration tends to lower the sex drive and was believed to increase the focus and mental capacity because a castrated man was thought to think about sex less often, which made them perfect candidates to work in the harem. While one could say that the women who grew up in the harem had no experience as anything other than a slave or concubine, the truth is, they would have had no choice in the matter if they did. It's also true that the vast majority of women taken or brought as slaves in Europe or otherwise were not in the harem and lived far more unpleasant lives. They were also sexual slaves, most having little or no choice as to when and with whom, as concubines were sometimes given as gifts or thank yous from the Sultan to an esteemed guest. That said, no other man was to touch a woman without the Sultan's permission. That could result in an excruciating death, not just for the man. The Ottoman torturers were very inventive. A big favorite was eye gouging, especially with women, cutting off noses.
Impaling, flogging, burning, hanging, and beheading All were normal punishments in Muslim culture, but for a slave to escape and to be recaptured or simply charged with a crime, these punishments, execution by any means, were standard procedures. This was mainly due to the vast numbers of potential slaves that cost nothing to acquire and were worked to death in various ways.
To quote William Phillips, to describe the true slaves, a new word was coined, derived from the most numerous ethnic group in the medieval slave trade, the Slavs. The word has cognates in all Western languages. Slave in English, esclave in French, esclavo in Spanish, escravo in Portuguese, esclavo in Italian, and sclave in German. Same linguistic change happened in Greek, where the word sklavos, derived from the original Byzantine word for the Slavs, today means slave. Same thing also briefly happened in Arabic, where, during the Middle Ages, the word sakaliba could mean both Slavs or white slaves. Although this change wasn't uniform across the Arab world, nor did it survive past the Middle Ages.
For a period of 200 years, English merchant and fishing vessels were regularly attacked by the Barbary pirates, and thousands of sailors sold into the slave markets of North Africa, most never to return. Let's be clear, the English were not the only white slaves to be found in the North African slave markets. In fact, they were actually in the minority. The lands closer to the Barbary coast were raided far more frequently. The turning point in this first Barbary War came on land in 1805 at the Battle of Demar. A small force of US Marines, together with Greek and Arab mercenaries, defeated the army of Tripoli. It was the first time the US Marines, admittedly a very small number of them, had fought and raised a US flag on foreign soil. The battle brought the Pasha to the negotiating table. All captive American slaves and crew from the USS Philadelphia were freed, and the Americans sailed home, having made their first impact on the world stage. Indeed, the battle is recorded in the line "The Shores of Tripoli" in the Marine hymn.
From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli are the beginning lines from the United States Marine Corps hymn, and the Tripoli that's mentioned is the largest city in today's Libya. The hymn was written sometime after 1867, and these lines commemorate two of the Marine Corps' most famous battles: the Halls of Montezuma, referring to the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 48, and the Shores of Tripoli refers to the battles the Marine Corps, along with the U.S. Navy, fought with the infamous Barbary pirates, who terrorized the coast of North Africa, the Mediterranean Sea, and indeed a large part of Europe for 3 centuries.
By 1815, they were once more capturing American vessels and their crews, along with any other nations that didn't pay them a tribute. And once more, the USA decided to take a stand, this time against Algiers. Despite giving the British fleet a mauling, the Dey of Algiers slowly found himself outgunned. Pellu's Royal Naval Fleet and their Dutch allies fired 50,000 rounds of shot and used over 100 tons of gunpowder that afternoon. The Dey's fleet was destroyed. 37 ships sunk, the rest run aground. His shore batteries were destroyed. His losses, whilst vague, are estimated at anything up to 5,000. In the ensuing treaty, the Dey accepted the original terms offered by Pellew. Over 3,000 European slaves were released, and he was also forced to return a tribute paid previously by the Americans. It was the beginning of the end of the Barbary pirates and their slave trade.
King James I of England, crowned on March 23, 1603, reportedly issued the Order of Banishment. This allowed those Irish captured to be sold, a permanent banishment. After nearly a decade, the king gave permission for the English Governor-General to collect and sell the captured Irish soldiers as slaves and send them to the New World in the Americas. By 1637, approximately 69% of the population of Montserrat were Irish. Many were indentured servants, yet some were slaves. The rationale was simple. Black slaves had to be purchased at a cost of around 20 to 50 pounds sterling, a huge sum of money in those days. However, Irish slaves were sold for 900 pounds of cotton per person, but also traded for tobacco and indigo in a straight barter system. It would appear that the Irish then became the largest source of slaves for English slave traders and plantation owners at that time, far surpassing the African slave trade until the early to mid-1700s. Between 1641, during the Irish Rebellion, to 1652, it has been stated that over 550,000 Irish were killed by English forces, and 300,000 more were sold as slaves, mostly military-aged men. Their children, especially women and girls, were sold and considered quite valuable in the domestic service roles. The greatest perpetrator of this was Oliver Cromwell, who defeated Charles I in 1649 during the English Civil War and had him executed. Between 1651 and 1660, the Irish slaves far outnumbered the colonists in all areas. To Hell or to Connacht proclamation was issued during the Act of Settlement of 1662. This was when the English began confiscating all Irish-held lands, and the native Irish were relocated west of the Shannon River. Those who resisted were sent to the West Indies as slaves or executed. The English could kill the Irish without penalty, but selling them offered great profit. Many argue that these were indentured servants, not slaves, yet there are no records of contracts between those forcibly removed and their benefactors. One may assume that, given the barter system of using tobacco and cotton as a trade item for workers, that these deported Irish were, in fact, slaves.
On July 30th of 1676, they issue what's called the Declaration of the People of Virginia. And this is, in a sense, like the Declaration of Independence. They're writing a letter saying that the colonial government is corrupt, that these are elites, that they have special contracts with Native Americans, that they're unfair to the people. And they actually march on Jamestown with about 500 men. And on September 19th of 1676, they burn it to the ground. They burn down Jamestown. Berkeley flees, and it looks like this rebellion is going to work, that Bacon is going to replace the colonial governor, that he is going to overthrow the reins of power, and then he gets dysentery. So it's a failed rebellion. At the end of the day, Bacon dies of dysentery, and the rebellion goes down in flames. And the biggest effect is going to be that this really is going to expose class tensions to the elite, that something needs to be done. Bacon was promising freedom to any blacks that joined his cause, and the idea of poor blacks and poor whites uniting is a plantation owner's biggest nightmare. So while we certainly can draw some lines to the concept of this is a rebellion against authority that exposed this vulnerability in the class system of poor blacks and poor whites. So the head right system is going to come to an end. No longer are elites going to bring indentured servants over and make them do the labor, because it's just going to create too many problems, because these indentured servants are going to want equality, they're going to want the same rights, and it's just going to create more problems down the road. But the head right system and indentured servant system is going to end and be replaced by the African slave system. Now, slaves were in Jamestown since 1619, but they weren't the predominant working labor force. Now they're going to become the predominant working labor force. The slave system, as we know it, that runs its course through American history up to the Civil War, really has its roots sown at the end of Bacon's rebellion.
Many who have dismissed the anti-slavery words of the founders of the American Republic as just rhetoric have not bothered to check the facts of history. Washington, Jefferson, and other founders did not just talk, they acted. Even when they acted within the political and legal constraints of their times, they acted repeatedly, sometimes winning and sometimes losing. One of the early battles that was lost was Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence, which criticized King George III for having enslaved Africans and for overriding colonial Virginia's attempt to ban slavery. The Continental Congress removed that phrase under pressure from representatives from the South. When Jefferson drafted a state constitution for Virginia in 1776, his draft included a clause prohibiting any more importation of slaves, and, in 1783, Jefferson included in a new draft of a Virginia Constitution a proposal for gradual emancipation of slaves. He was defeated in both these efforts. On the national scene, Jefferson returned to the battle once again in 1784, proposing a law declaring slavery illegal in all western territories of the country as it existed at that time. Such a ban would have kept slavery out of Alabama and Mississippi. The bill lost by one vote, that of a legislator too sick to come and vote. Afterwards, Jefferson said that the fate of millions unborn was hanging on the tongue of one man, and heaven was silent in that awful moment. 3 years later, however, Congress compromised by passing the Northwest Ordinance, making slavery illegal in the upper Western Territories, while allowing it in the lower Western Territories. In short, the ideology of the American Revolution was not just words. Those ideas were not wholly without effect, even in the South. During the years immediately following creation of the United States, for a number of southern states eased legal restrictions on private manumissions during that era, and many blacks were freed voluntarily. The free black population, which had been growing faster than the slave population in the decades of large-scale private manumissions immediately following the American Revolution, now grew much more slowly than the slave population in the decades leading up to the Civil War. The American Colonization Society and many others persisted in the hope that slavery could be ended as an institution without releasing into American society millions of former slaves by establishing colonies for them in Africa or Haiti. Thomas Jefferson likewise owned a plantation encumbered by debt, as did many other Southerners, so emancipation of all of Jefferson's slaves was never a real possibility, though he did manage to free 9 of them. George Washington was one of those who had inherited slaves and, dying childless, freed his slaves in his will, effective on the death of his wife. George Washington had said of slavery as a national issue, "There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of it." But like Burke, he saw a need for a plan of some sort, rather than simply freeing millions of slaves in a newly emerging nation surrounded by threatening powers, just as the freed slaves themselves would be surrounded by a hostile population. In short, the moral principle was easy, but figuring out how to apply it in practice was not.
Where diplomacy had failed, the Royal Navy had to succeed. It's one thing declaring a writ that people may no longer profit from the trading of human beings, it's another thing to enforce that. The institution of slavery was formally abolished in the British Empire in 1833. The abolition of slavery became the British project. It captured the hearts and minds of the entire country, from the highest lord to the lowest peasant. This is certainly how the British saw it. For example, this spirit of chivalry, we see it in acts of heroism by land and sea in fights against the slave trade. Alfred Tennyson, the unweary, unostentatious, and inglorious crusade of England against slavery may probably be regarded as among the 3 or 4 perfectly virtuous pages comprised in the History of Nations. William Lecky. All of this was done against the vested financial interests of hundreds of thousands of people. Entire nations were against the idea of abolishing slavery and the slave trade. The very notion was alien to the human existence until Britain made it happen. This was the flag of a nation that defied human convention for a point of principle, and spent its blood, sweat, tears and treasure to enforce it on the world. This is the flag of the nation that accepted the absolute moral truth that slavery is wrong. No matter what riches can be amassed, no matter what power can be gained, no matter the cost, slavery had to be abolished. That was the British Crusade. When Britain held the reins of world power, that is what she did with it.
One of the few individuals whose appeal to President Abraham Lincoln for clemency was denied was a ship's captain named Nathaniel Gordon, who was hanged in 1862 after having been caught bringing slaves out of Africa. Clearly, the evil nature of slavery was recognized by the severe penalties imposed in America on those who continued to bring slaves from Africa, though there was not yet a consensus on what to do about the millions of enslaved people already in the country.
The most powerful, the most damaging of all of these laws were the vagrancy statutes. In every southern state, you became a criminal if you could not prove at any given moment that you were employed.
After emancipation, industrialists replaced slaves with convicts, acquiring thousands from state and county governments.
You can't drive free labor the same way that you can force prisoners to mine 5 tons of coal a day. And this is why people like Milner wanted prisoners in his coal mines. He saw them as a great source of profit, and he didn't have to worry about labor disputes. Whippings, keeping people chained up, brutal kinds of physical torture, and mental abuse are the norm. A lot of the things that kept people in control under slavery are amplified under this convict system.
They were overseen by J.W. Comer, the former slaveholder, whose enterprises now included convict mining. Exposés of the convict labor system described it as worse than slavery. Slaves had been a significant long-term investment. A convict could be rented for as little as $9 a month.
It was never in the economic interest of a slave owner to kill his own slaves or to abuse them so terribly that they couldn't work anymore. So their economic value protected them in certain ways. After the Civil War, someone working these kinds of forced laborers would push them to the very limits of human endurance.
Convict miners cost as much as 50 to 80% less than free miners and could be worked 6 days a week. Their presence allowed companies to depress wages and resist unions. An exposé of peonage in Florida inflamed readers. The victim, 22-year-old Martin Tabert, was white. A traveler from North Dakota, Tabert was picked up in a sweep in rural Florida, charged with vagrancy, and sold to a lumber company. He died soon after at the hands of a brutal overseer.
First, he whipped him on his bare back 30 or 40 times. Tabert then kept lying there, so the boss continued to whip him another 30 or 40 times with a heavy leather lash. Tabor crawled to his feet, and the guard began pursuing him through the camp, whipping him as they ran. Finally, after almost 150 lashes, Tabert made it back to the cot that he had in a simple cabin somewhere, collapsed into his bed, and never stood up again.
The outcry over Tabert's death helped to end state leasing in Florida. Nearly 80 years had passed since the United States ratified the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now, in December 1941, President Roosevelt took steps to finally enforce it. Just 5 days after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's Attorney General issued Circular 3591. It said that federal attorneys were to aggressively prosecute any case of involuntary servitude or slavery, not only those defined as peonage.
He says whether they're being held there because of a threat of imprisonment or out of violence, whatever the mechanism is that is holding people in slavery, you should go after it.
The records are incomplete, but it's estimated that in the 80 years following the Civil War, as many as 800,000 people had faced the South's corrupt system of justice. Huge numbers of those arrested were forced into involuntary servitude.
Deutsch himself, in the CIA's report, he admitted that the CIA was involved with known Contras who were running drugs, cocaine. But he started the report by saying, in our investigations, we found no evidence of conspiracy.
Now Frederick Hitz comes out and he admits that CIA was protecting drug dealers in Latin America and other places, but didn't have to report it because of an agreement with the Justice Department that they don't have to report these drug traffickers.
I mean, that's to me is the amazing part, is when you get a federal agency to admit that they were involved in drug trafficking and still nobody knows about it. There's something wrong with the media in this country.
We were on the Montel Williams show together, and he and I had the discussion where I said, Gary, you're making a mistake.
Right now, what we're succumbing to is what Central Intelligence wants. We're making it a black issue.
And it's not.
And it's not.
Fact is, CIA couldn't give a damn who it went to. My own daughter was a crack cocaine addict then, and I'm a white Jew.
Was CIA involved in drug trafficking? Legally, yes, they were.
Nearly half of the Three Strikes inmates were serving 25 to life sentences for non-violent crimes.
It resulted in judges having to mete out sentences that were disproportionate to the criminal conduct.
He's accused of stealing a slice of pizza from a group of children at a beach pizza parlor.
The media, which had fueled the public anger that led to the law, now had a field day with the most extreme cases. There was the pizza thief, the cookie thief, the bicycle thief. All received 25 to life sentences for petty crimes because of more serious crimes in their past.
The question that's being raised is this really a good idea?
The three strikes law ended up populating our prisons, which are grossly overcrowded, with petty thieves and drug addicts.
Garcetti now regrets some of the sentences his office sought against non-violent offenders, especially mentally ill and homeless people.
Those are the kinds of people that shouldn't have been sentenced under the three-strike law. Those are the people that should have received some help.
About 3,000 inmates are eligible for release after Californians voted in November 2012 to revise the three strikes law, so only violent or serious felonies count as a third strike.
Why does the U.S. jail more people than any other country? One reason? Mandatory minimums. These were introduced in the 1980s and apply to low-level crimes. Mandatory minimums mean convicted people have to serve a minimum sentence, whether or not a judge thinks they deserve it. For example, drug crimes involving crack, heroin, or marijuana trigger minimum sentences. So do crimes involving firearms, pornography, and immigration. But opponents say the punishment doesn't always fit the crime. Take the story of Kemba Smith, an unemployed woman who moved in with her drug dealer boyfriend. After he was murdered, she was charged with conspiracy to traffic all the drugs he left behind. Mandatory minimum sentence, 24 years. In another case, John Horner, a 46-year-old fast food worker with prescription painkillers, met a friend who wanted some of his pills. The friend turned out to be an undercover agent. Conviction for drug trafficking, 25-year minimum. At 25, Timothy Tyler got caught selling LSD with his dad. Because he had been caught selling twice before, the mandatory sentence, life. Since mandatory minimums were imposed, there's been a 500% increase in the incarcerated population at a cost of $80 billion to run the prison system. Is it time for mandatory minimums to end?
Also tonight, one of the state's top legal experts calls the new truth in sentencing law a disaster.
And he says there is history to prove it. Attorney David Rabin crafted a very similar law back in 1979 that eliminated early release for any inmates. In a matter of years, though, Tennessee prisons became so overcrowded it led to riots in 4 separate facilities, and a federal judge had to intervene. Rabin says the new law will do the same thing.
Just have an expansion like a balloon in the prisons. You'll have overcrowding times 10.
Rabin says unless the state commits to spending hundreds of millions to build new prisons and hire more correctional officers, then there will be a repeat of the 1980s. He says truth in sentencing may sound good to voters in an election year, but the truth is early release for good behavior, he says it's key to keeping the prison system operational. And Vicki, the truth in sentencing bill became law, we should say, without Governor Lee signing it, right?
Right.
That's the first time that this has happened.
And Rory, the governor also refused to sign a bill making it a felony to camp on all public property unless stated otherwise. Governor Lee says he was worried about the unintended consequences, so he didn't sign either one, but they both still became laws. He would have to veto the bills to stop them.
Perhaps the biggest criticism of for-profit prisons is that they have a perverse incentive to keep inmates coming back to jail. From a cynical perspective, the last thing a private prison wants is for inmates to become law-abiding citizens upon their release, as this would decrease demand for their facilities in the future. One of the most revolting manifestations of this perverse incentive was the so-called Kids for Cash scandal in 2008. A juvenile prison company called Mid-Atlantic Youth Services Corp. Paid $2.8 million in bribes to a Pennsylvania judge to sentence about 2,000 juvenile offenders to extended sentences for absurdly minor crimes. Some of the crimes included mocking an assistant principal on MySpace and trespassing in vacant buildings.